everyone, this is Esther Camacho with the Mcallen Public Library. In honor of Pride Month, we have a special guest, Gabriel Sanchez, who's going to discuss the LGBTQ plus community in the Rio Grande Valley. So let's go take a listen.
Hi, my name is Gabriel Sanchez. I'm super excited to be part of the Mcallen Public Library's Pride Month programming, and the topic we're going to be discussing today is the Valley's LGBTQIA plus history. We have a really rich, really important, but very underdocumented LGBTQ plus history right here in the Rio Grande Valley, and I'm really excited to share some of that with y'all today. And I think what we're witnessing today is history in the making here at the Mcallen Public Library. The fact that the Mcallen Public Library has made a statement being so inclusive of diversity in different communities is an important part of our history moving into the future. So I'm honored and excited to be here, and I'll jump right in. So a lot of this is based on my research into the Rio Grande Valley's LGBTQ plus history. I've grown up in the Valley all my life, but like a lot of people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community, I felt I needed to leave the Valley for a time in order to be able to be like my authentic self. And then I came back, and when I came back, I had a lot of questions about the community here and the history of the community here, and I really wanted to look into and investigate it. So I started doing some interviews with people, and this is based on some of those interviews and some of what I was able to find, and I'll just go ahead and dive right into it. But I'm currently working on a documentary called Pansy Pachanga with two other people, Ronnie Garza and Charlie Vela. Ronnie Garza and I are directing, and Charlie Vela is a part of our production team, and it's set to be completed sometime this year, and we've been working on it for about 2.5 years. And it's a documentary detailing the Valley's LGBTQ plus history and chronicling some of the history I'll be talking about today. And this isn't a quote that I always start off with. I think it's really important. It says, it's a quote by Joan Nestle, who is the founder of the Lesbian Herstory Archives. She's a big inspiration for me in terms of communities documenting their own histories. And she says, history is not a dead thing or a sure thing. It is lived with our choices and our dreams. It is the story of our glories and our sadnesses. It is always a collective memory, as complicated and contradictory as people who lived it, but it is always a people's story. And I think this is really important to remember. A lot of this history has not been documented yet, and this is some of the first steps in documenting it. This LGBTQ plus history tends not to be documented a lot, and it tends to be left out of history, and that's a lot of times it's by design, right? So if you're from the Rio Grande Valley and you're a part of the LGBTQ plus community, a lot of times you're not able to find representations of yourself in the history books or in history class. And so it's up to communities, oftentimes marginalized communities, to record their own histories and to find their own histories and to document their own histories and archive them. And that's what a lot of LGBTQ plus people have been doing in recent years, is reclaiming our place in history by documenting and cataloging and collecting all the history around us. But I also think this quote is really important because this is all based on oral history. For the majority of this, I would say the vast majority of this, it's not something you can just go and Google. This is based on original research and interviews, primarily based on oral history. And oral history can be a little conflicting because, and the older I get, I realize, like sometimes I forget what year it was when I did something 2 or 3 years ago, and people have different memories of things. And that's okay. It doesn't invalidate the fact that they remember things differently, doesn't invalidate their stories. People have different accounts. People remember things differently, and so a lot of oral history is piecing together history from people's memories, which can again be sometimes contradictory. And so I always preface this by saying that a lot of this is still a work in progress, and we may find out more in the future, and that would be great. And it might contradict something that I say in here today that's happened before, and that's just a part of the process of documenting history. You can't document a community's history for the first time in some ways and not run into some issues with, figuring out where everything fits into the timeline. And so this is just a sort of a disclaimer that some of this information may be updated in the future. And again, there are challenges when working with oral history, and there are challenges when working with a community that by design and was often not documented. A lot of times in previous decades, if you were a member of the LGBTQ plus community in a place like the Rio Grande Valley, you had to function underground in some ways. And so this community wasn't always looking to be found. And because of that, it's sometimes hard to fill in certain historical gaps. So when I started doing this research, and again, this started as an oral history project where I interviewed several people, I had a lot of questions. I'd grown up in the Valley all my life, but like a lot of queer and trans people who grow up in the Rio Grande Valley, I never really knew exactly where I fit in. Because I thought that there wasn't a lot of LGBTQ plus history in the Valley. I thought we didn't have this like presence, this documented historical presence, and I thought that if we had, it wasn't very notable. I grew up thinking that there wasn't a lot about this community to document, and I became really interested in LGBTQ plus history when I started coming out when I was younger, and I found a lot of validation and a lot of affirmation in looking at, for example, the stories of like Sylvia Rivera, but I didn't think the Valley had any history like that. And so when I moved back here a few years ago and I was really struggling with how I was going to be authentically myself in a place like the Rio Grande Valley, which I know can be really hard for anybody who's different, and especially for LGBTQIA plus people sometimes, I wanted to know how we fit into the history of this region. So I started asking myself some questions. One of them was, what was daily life like for LGBTQIA people in the Valley in previous generations? What were spaces that were important to the community? How did people find and create community? What were the risks that people faced if they were visibly out, and what challenges did they encounter? And what firsthand documents did the community leave? For example, art, pictures, other items, things like that. What were some of the firsthand documents that the community had left behind? And again, this was a community that often functioned by and survived by remaining underground and to a certain degree in hiding from the general population, right? This is a community that's all around us, but in a time like the 60s or the 70s, couldn't necessarily be visible or else face a lot of risks. And so it was a little complicated to find out how to document the history of a community that didn't always want to be seen. But these were some of the questions that I sought to answer. And I interviewed some people from different generations of the Valley's LGBTQ plus history. I started with an uncle of mine and just sort of wrote down everything he remembered about growing up here in the 60s and 70s and what some of the bars were back then. I interviewed a couple, two women who were really involved in LGBTQ plus and HIV/AIDS activism in the 80s and 90s here in the Rio Grande Valley and who continue to do amazing things today. I interviewed one of the first employees of the Valley AIDS Council, a drag queen who started performing in the early 1990s. And from there, I just kind of started expanding. I asked them who else I should talk to. And this eventually evolved into me doing presentations on this at the library, doing presentations on this at local colleges and universities, and at the Museum of South Texas History, as well as writing a few pieces for an online publication. And then from there, it evolved into the documentary. And so at this point, this is based on interviews with about 100, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 100 people who represent different generations and different identities when it comes to the LGBTQ plus community. So I talk a lot about queer spaces when I do these presentations. I talk a lot about gay bars. And sometimes people wonder why. I've had a lot of people tell me, like, why do you put so much emphasis on just the bars? Like, wasn't there more than just the bars? And of course, we've existed for thousands of years. We've existed in every community. And of course, we've existed outside of bars, right? But I think people underestimate, and people my age and younger tend to underestimate how important a place like a gay bar could be in a place like the Valley if you were a member of the LGBTQ plus community. Things have changed so much, and in many ways for the better over the past few decades, that it's hard for people to imagine a time when you could only be fully yourself in a bar. And that's why these spaces were so important for the community in previous generations. So I'm going to talk a lot about some of the gay bars, but I just wanted to point out that in previous decades, these were often the only queer spaces that existed where people could gather, and often the only places where people could freely, fully be themselves. Often the only places to find other people like yourself and develop platonic, romantic, and sexual relationships. They gave people the opportunity to find community and learn from others. And in the absence of accepting and affirming venues, gay bars were often the only places that were open to the community for important community events. So these were more than just bars, because it was really hard to find a venue that accepted you if you were queer and trans. The bars often became really important spaces for people to have commitment ceremonies in the years before marriage equality was legal. They became important spaces for people to have memorials, for example, for people who were murdered due to transphobic violence or homophobic violence, or people who lost their lives due to AIDS-related complications. They were important spaces for fundraisers. If a member of the community was in need, often others in the community would rally around them and have fundraisers for them in these bars. And you saw that a lot during the HIV/AIDS crisis as well. And so these bars were more than just places for people to drink and dance and hang out, although that was important too. They were spaces where people could explore their identity. There were spaces where people could find other people like themselves, experience community for the first time. And it's important to remember that not too long ago, there were people who could only really be themselves one night a week at one of these gay bars. And that's one of the reasons I talk about them so much. They also allowed for people to, so I also talk about drag a lot. And I also think drag is really important. And that's another thing that's hard for some people to understand, why drag is so important. A lot of people tend to think of it as just like frivolous or just entertainment. And drag is so much more than just that, and it always has been. But drag really allowed, and participating in drag allowed for queer and trans people to recreate and perform gender on their own terms. It gave a lot of people in the community a platform to exhibit talents, for example, sewing, dancing, doing hair, that they might not have had a chance to display anywhere else at the time. And it allowed people to create representations of themselves through popular culture. So if you are an LGBTQIA+ person growing up in a time like the 1970s, you're not gonna see a lot of representations of yourself on TV. You're not gonna see a lot of people who look like you or who reflect what you're going through. But you can go to a bar and see a drag show that reflects how you're feeling. And it gave people a chance to participate in culture in a way that wasn't really available to them at the time. Drag was also really important because it gave people a space to navigate their relationship to traditional culture. We have a really rich culture here in the Valley of the traditional, the Hano and Mexican American and Mexican cultures that we engage with and that are all sort of mixed together. But if you're a person who feels rejected by your community, sometimes you might not have a chance to participate in that culture. And so through drag, people could celebrate their culture in a way that was authentic to them. And you see some pictures of some drag performers wearing mariachi outfits. Drag also gave people in the community examples of visibility, authenticity, and leadership. A lot of people who I've interviewed who never once did drag said how important it was for them to go into a gay bar and see a drag queen celebrate, or a drag king celebrating themselves, loving all of who they were, and being so comfortable in their own skin, being so comfortable being visible, and what an effect that had on them. And drag also allowed for the creation of families and support systems to replace or supplement unaccepting families. So a lot of people, when they would come out as queer or trans, would get disowned or kicked out or pushed out by their families of origin. And a lot of time, the only place they knew where to go was a gay bar. And drag queens and drag kings created family systems, and this wasn't just in the Valley, but you saw it here in the Valley going back to the 1970s, created drag houses or drag families where a drag queen would adopt you and teach you the ways of doing drag and also be like a mentor and parental figure. And there were cases and instances of drag queens housing youth who had been kicked out by their families. And again, drag was a really important way to raise money and also raise attention for important community causes. One drag queen that I interviewed who really illuminated this for me talked about how during the HIV/AIDS crisis, when a drag queen was talking, people would listen. Whereas if someone just came up to talk about like statistics related to HIV and AIDS, people would kind of tune out because they were at a bar and they weren't there for that. But if the drag queen came up, everybody would listen. And so drag had a lot of power to capture the community's attention, and that became really important when some drag queens became involved in, for example, combating HIV stigma, or raising awareness around homophobia, or raising money to support people who were affected by the AIDS epidemic. And I just wanted to make one quick note about activism. We talk a lot about activism in the LGBTQIA+ community and what it means and what it looks like. And I had no idea when I was growing up that there was HIV and AIDS activism and LGBTQ+ activism in the Valley in the 80s and 90s, that we as a community fought for our rights and fought for respect and dignity and visibility. So there was activism in the traditional sense. And this is a picture of two of the first people I interviewed who are very important to this project, Alicia Lugo and Laurie Coffey, who are a couple that lives in Harlingen. And this is them at a protest in 1995 at the state capitol for hate crimes legislation. There was a lot of activism that looked like that. But I also wanted to point out that activism can take many forms, and it can look like just being visible, just being yourself in an environment where it's not always easy to do that. It can mean refusing to back down in the face of repression. It can mean providing education to other people, and it can mean creating affirming and supportive spaces for your own community. So activism doesn't just have to look like lobbying and fighting and carrying signs, although we did have some of that. It can also just mean being yourself even when everyone around you is telling you that you shouldn't be or can't be, and giving an example to other people that it is possible to be themselves as well. And I think sometimes we tend to, when we talk about the progress that the LGBTQ+ community has made over the past several decades, we tend to think that it's the result of people outside of our community, who were kind and nice and became more tolerant and therefore gave us our rights, right? And the reality is a lot more complicated. I think we've made a lot of progress in the community because more and more of us refused, even if it was risky, even if it was dangerous, refused to hide who we were. And through doing that, created a change in the world around us, created a change in the communities around us, and pushed for more acceptance and pushed for more affirming spaces in that way. And so I think it's really important to remember that activism can look like just being visible when no one else is. And that's one of the main important points of the documentary, really, is that like individuals have the power to affect their own realities through everyday actions. It doesn't have to come from Washington. It doesn't have to come from national organizations in San Francisco or DC or New York. There was a lot of people who were doing the most important thing they could possibly do in just by being themselves and creating community. And a quick note on terminology and identity. When people talk about LGBTQ plus history, there's a tendency to think that it's all gay men, right? Or just gay and lesbian people. And a lot of times when we talk about the LGBTQIA plus acronym, people tend to think that that's a brand new thing. When you talk about non-binary people or intersex, asexual, pansexual, bisexual people, even transgender people, there's a tendency to think that that's all recent developments, right? And that the majority of our history has just been led by gay men and lesbian women. And that's not accurate. Those terms have not always existed, and even when they did, people didn't always have access to those terms. But people who are non-binary, who are asexual, who are pansexual, bisexual, transgender, have always existed and have always been a really important part of our community. So if you look back to like the earliest gay bars and queer spaces in the Valley, there were trans people who were actively participating in those spaces, even if they didn't have the term trans to describe their experiences. In the 80s and 90s, there were really important members of the community who were what today we would consider non-binary or intersex or asexual, but who didn't have the language to describe that at the time. And there are a lot of people who have since come out as trans or as non-binary. And even in the process of interviewing these people, sometimes they come out after I've interviewed them, and that's an important part of their story. And one person I talked to, for example, said, well, back when I was younger, we never had the word trans or non-binary, but he was surrounded by trans women. There was just no language for it. And if you look at, like, for example, the Valley's first known LGBTQ plus advocacy group, Valley Voice, it was called Valley Voice, a gay and lesbian alliance. But if you look at the membership, there were a lot of really important, really active people who were bisexual or who were transgender or who we would today consider non-binary. And so I just wanted to throw that in there, that this history is a history of the entire community. And the community has always been made up of different people: gay men, drag queens, transgender women, non-binary people, transmasculine people, and asexual people, pansexual, and so on. And so these are pictures of some of these identities documented in some of this early history. And on that note, this idea that LGBTQI plus people are something new, that's not historically accurate or culturally accurate. If you look at different cultures around the world, people we would today consider LGBTQIA plus have always existed. And in a lot of cultures, they were viewed as something natural and normal and just a part of life. In a lot of cultures, they were not only tolerated or affirmed or accepted, they were also celebrated because they were viewed as people who combined traditionally masculine and traditionally feminine elements and were viewed as a gift because of that. But even in the United States, almost every culture had a documented tradition of accepting not only people we would today consider LGBTQ+, but also of acknowledging that gender was more complex than just the binary, right? So there were terms for genders beyond just male and female. In some indigenous cultures, there were 3 or 4 or 5 different words for different genders. And there was an understanding that gender just wasn't what you were born with, but gender was something that you grew up into and identified as. And so when we say that non-binary people are something new, that it's just a creation of the internet, or it's just kids wanting attention, non-binary people have existed throughout time. Transgender people have existed throughout time, including right here in the Rio Grande Valley. When some of the first European colonizers came into what is now known as the Rio Grande Valley and what is northeastern Mexico and southeastern Texas, they documented seeing in some of the different indigenous communities, and this was their language, men who were living with men and men who were dressed as women. That's the language that they had to describe that at the time, but that was an important documentation that this diversity has always existed and that it's been here for a very long time. And so when people tell you that being LGBTQIA+ is something brand new, they're ignoring history because there's a presence going back thousands of years, even in the Rio Grande Valley. And when I've done these presentations, sometimes I'll ask the audience, like, when do you think the first documented, recorded instance of LGBTQ plus people in the Rio Grande Valley is. And some people will say 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, but it actually goes back to the 1600s. And I think that's really important to remember. Even Cabeza de Vaca, when he was wandering through what is now known as southeastern Texas, documented and noticed that there were these gender variant or non-binary individuals living in these different indigenous communities. And it's important to remember that every indigenous community had their own terminology and their own traditions, but if you look at some of these books, there's long lists of the different gender identities that existed in these different cultures that have been documented. And then we kind of have a historical gap. So even though we know there were LGBTQIA plus people or gender variant people, non-binary people, third gender people in the Rio Grande Valley when it was first, when European colonizers first began to interact with it, once Western European Christianity and first Spain and then Mexico and then the United States was established control over the Rio Grande Valley, there wasn't any documented instances that we know of people who were queer or trans, but we know that they existed because they've always existed, and we know that life must have been very difficult and challenging for them. We just don't have a lot of recorded information. Where we start to get filling in some of the gaps in the historical record is in the 1940s and 1950s, and one of the reasons that we have this information is because William S. Burroughs, who was a popular beat poet who was not from the Valley, spent some time living in the Valley. And there is a great book called Beats in South Texas, The Lost Years of William S. Burroughs, that was written by an STC professor named Robert Johnson. It's a great book, and because he was documenting William S. Burroughs' time here in the Rio Grande Valley, he documents some of the LGBTQ plus community that existed at the time, because Burroughs was queer, and so he was interacting with other queer people while he was down here. And what the book documents is that there were some instances of some very visible gay men who were, starting in the 1940s, able to live their lives openly with more or less ease, right? There wasn't a lot of consequences for these men. There were some who were involved in the community theater and FAR. There were some who were involved in kind of like the high society of Mcallen. But for the most part, these were all men, they were all white, and they were all wealthy. And so they had a degree of privilege that allowed them to be more or less open about being gay without suffering a lot of societal consequences. There was a flower shop in downtown Mcallen that was owned by a gay couple that had been together for years, and they provided flowers to all of the middle and upper class in Mcallen for like important events like weddings and sweet 16s and things like that. And so they were accepted by the community, but it was also because they were able to provide a service to the community. We also know, because of this, that there were a lot of gay men from Texas who would travel into Reynosa, Mexico to interact with the queer community there. And we also know that there were a lot of closeted people who would frequent Old 83, which at the time was very rural, kind of out there, who would go there to find other people for kind of anonymous one-time encounters. This is a postcard of Joe's Place. Joe's Place was a place in Reynosa that was open in the 1940s, and it was super popular. People would cross the border to go, and it was really extravagant. There were like live animals that would wander around. People would have drinking contests with a bear, like an actual bear. There were peacocks and other animals that would just kind of wander through the tables where people were sitting and drinking. And it was a pretty well-known place in Reynosa. And the reason I'm mentioning it, and this is again courtesy of Mr. Johnson, the Joe's Place was one of the first places along the border where we know that drag shows took place. So again, it was in Reynosa, and they had a family-friendly show around 9, and then topless dancers around midnight. But then if you stayed until around 2 or 3, you would get to see a drag show. And this is the first instance that we have, again, recorded of a drag show taking place along the border. We don't know anything about the drag queens who took part in those drag shows, whether or not they were gay men or transgender women or people who just did it for entertainment value. Probably some mix of the three based on what we know about the history, but we'll never know for sure, right? Unless we find somebody who actually took part in those shows. This is a postcard of Joe's Place that I found on the internet, on eBay, and I bought it. And it looks, you know, if you imagine this drag show taking place in the 1940s and imagine what the lives of the people taking part in it must have been like. Another important early part of the history is Glorion Saldua. And Glorion Saldua is a writer and a scholar who was from the Rio Grande Valley, but who wasn't really known in the Rio Grande Valley during her lifetime. She edited a book called This Bridge Called My Back, along with Cherry Moraga, and she wrote a book called Borderlands La Frontera, which was published in 1987. And those are two foundational texts that are used a lot in feminist studies and queer studies and in Chicano and Latinx studies. And so she had this like global impact, but she wasn't really recognized in the Valley. but she grew up here in the 40s and 50s and 60s. She grew up in Hargill, which is where a lot of her family had been for generations. And she left the valley at a young age. Like a lot of LGBTQ plus people, she didn't feel like she could be herself and stay in the Rio Grande Valley. And then once she left, she used her experiences about growing up on the border and growing up in between all these different cultures and also being queer to write and inform her work, which again, was really, really important. Another contribution that Gloria made to our history, and I'm not going to talk too much about her because you can find a lot about her online, especially recently there's been a resurgence in interest in her importance to history and her importance to academia. And so I encourage you all to go out and read more about her. But her contributions to this work were really important in that she wrote not only did she write these texts, but she also wrote for an anthology about queer myth and queer legend. And in it, she talked about a myth that she grew up hearing where whenever queer people were talked about or were discussed, they used the term mitad y mitad to refer to them. So mitad y mitad means half and half in English. And so there was this idea that queer people spent half the year as male and half the year as female and literally transformed in the middle of the year to the opposite gender. And when her friend, Randy, who we interviewed for the documentary, who was the one who wrote, along with his partner and their daughter, this book, when he asked her about this, he said, "You meant figuratively?" And she said, no, we literally thought that queer people transformed in the middle of the year into another gender. And so it gives you a window into what ideas around queerness and queer people were at the time in the Rio Grande Valley. Another early window that's important is another writer who is less well-known and less documented. Her name was Raquel Gamez. She has also passed away. She wrote a series of 3 short stories called, they were 3 stories from the Gloria stories, A Baby for Adela, and A Matter of Fact. And these stories were all written and published in the 80s and early 1990s, but they take place in the Rio Grande Valley in 1969. Raquel herself was a lesbian woman from far, and so we can assume that the books were at least partially inspired by what she was seeing around her in the community. There are stories that take place in Granjeno, in Falfurrias, on South Padre Island, at the gay bar Duffy's in Mcallen, which I'll talk about in just a second. And they document the lives of these different characters who were queer or lesbian or trans, or what we would today consider trans. The story, the main character of a lot of these stories is an older person named Gloria. And if you read the book, if you read the stories, it really describes Gloria as what we would today consider trans-masculine. She dressed like a male, she wanted to be seen as a male, she even would draw on a beard. And so it's a really early documentation of trans-masculine experience, which was a history that's often hard to document in a place like the Valley. But these stories are really, really important for illuminating what, queerness might have been viewed like in the 1960s in the Rio Grande Valley. And one thing she does say in one of the stories is that there were queer people all around the valley, but that finding an out queer person was as rare as finding a donkey with wings. So it gives you some idea of how this community was really functioning in secret, and there weren't too many people who were willing to be out about their sexual orientation or their gender identity. There's also a story in which, and this is the last thing I'll mention about Rocky, there's a story in which a same-sex couple sneaks into a church because they want to get married, but they can't get married. And they sneak into a church while a straight couple is getting married, and they repeat the vows that the straight people are saying. And that's how they get married, right? So you get these little snippets that provide some insight into early Valley LGBTQ plus history. Rocky's stories are all out of print, but I was able to find them all by finding the different anthologies that they were published in. And one important thing you start to see in the late 1960s, and there's no real spark that starts it, there's no real reason for it, it's just something that you start to see happen. More and more queer and trans youth, even if they don't have that language, are coming out in Valley high schools, sometimes in high school, sometimes in junior high, and finding each other. So even before there's any gay bars, you start to see these little cliques form at different Valley schools of queer and trans kids. And one person, one of the oldest people I interviewed for the documentary is a woman named Sonia. She's a trans woman who grew up in Edinburgh. These are some early pictures of her with her family. And she talks about how when she was in junior high, 2 other, at the time, boys came up to her and said, "Oh, you're like us." And at first she was like, no, I'm not like you. And they were like, no, you're like us. And the 3 of them all started hanging out together. And even if they were bullied and picked on and at one point even forced out of school because of this, they found each other, supported each other, and were visible. And she also tells a story about how they connected with some of the other queer and trans kids at some of the other Valley schools. And they would, for example, go to football games together and all meet up, even though they were coming from the different schools, and they would like do cheerleading routines under the bleachers while the football game was going on. This is another picture that I love. The one on the left is a person named Frank Mendez, who we interviewed for the documentary, really important activist in the Valley. And these are him with two friends that he also met in middle school, and they remained friends. The one on the right passed away, but the other two are still friends to this day. And they all found each other, and this was in Mission. They were all bullied, they were all harassed for being different, but they would support each other through all of that. And Frank talks about how they would always go everywhere together, and that when they were bullied, they would do like the Charlie's Angels routine, and so people started calling them the Charlie's Angels. And this is a picture of Takisha Murray, who was a drag queen and trans woman who we also interviewed for the documentary. This is a picture of her wearing her mother's clothing in 1967, and I think it's a really beautiful early documentation of trans existence in the Valley. It's also a reminder that trans people have always existed, right? And that trans children have always existed. And then these are some pictures of, I was so happy to find these because we really struggled to uncover trans masculine history working on the documentary, and it was an important experience that I really wanted to document. And this is a person named Toya, who also went by Mark Anthony, and he was a drag king performer, and even if there wasn't language or terminology for it, he was somebody who was a really early example of what we would today consider a trans man or trans masculine. He went to school in Mission in the 1970s. He would show up dressed as a boy, going all the way back to junior high. He would ask to be called by he pronouns. He would ask to be called Mark or by different boy names, sometimes Joe. And later he was an important drag performer, and he even had drag children who were drag kings that would perform. And a lot of times when these groups started finding each other, they didn't really have anywhere that they could go to, there was, for example, that group in Edinburgh, the group in Mission, and there were like lesbian girls that found each other and hung out in schools in Mission in the 1970s, but there wasn't really any place for these people to go. And a lot of queer people just started congregating in the nature around them. So you saw a lot of people gathering in parks, you saw a lot of people gathering in nature centers. The Mcallen Nature Center had a reputation going back decades of being like a queer hangout spot. Cascade Park in Mcallen also had a lot of people because it was kind of out there at the time. And there was a lot of like woods around it. A lot of queer people would just go and hang out. And so these are some pictures that were given to me by Angela Garza, who is a queer musician herself, who we interviewed for the documentary. And they're pictures that were given to her mother by her uncle. Her uncle was a gay man who lived and grew up in the Valley and who passed away in 1975. And these are some pictures of him and his friends hanging out in the late 60s and early 1970s, hanging out in just parks. And what she said she understood from her mother when her mother gave her these pictures is that they didn't really have anywhere else they could go where they could be accepted. So they kind of had to make their own spaces out in the monte. And so you see them drinking and just being themselves in a way that they probably couldn't have anywhere else at the time. Archer Park in Mcallen starts to be one of the most visible queer spaces. It's a park in downtown Mcallen on Main Street. It's still there to this day. In the 50s and 60s, it started having a reputation for being like a hookup spot where men would go and meet each other, again, for like anonymous, maybe one-time encounters. But into the 1970s, it starts to become a more visible queer hangout spot. And again, you would have these like trans and gender nonconforming young people hitchhiking from across the valley to hang out. You would have lesbian women gather in the park, gay and bisexual men gather in the park. And on some nights, there would be crowds of as big as like 15 to 20 people all hanging out in the park. You would see people, some circling around driving, some walking, some people parked in the parking lot right across from it. Now there's a bank there, but at the time there really wasn't anything. And they would all congregate in the park to find each other and find community. And Archer Park continues to carry a reputation to this day of being like a queer space. When some of the first gay bars opened in the Valley later, there's people who hang out in Archer Park and then go to the bars because some of the first few gay bars in the Valley were walking distance from the park. And then you had young people who couldn't get into those bars who would just hang out in the park all night. Later, when there were more gay bars, people would go to the bars and then at 2 a.m. after the bars closed, come to Archer Park and hang out. The area was also called the Circuit or the Fruit Loop. And it was known that the area around it was also frequented by a lot of queer people who would go walking. And police would harass the people that would gather there. There's some articles from the Mcallen Monitor where they talk about how in 1991, the police brought new life into Archer Park. And they don't use the word queer or gay or trans, but you know what they're talking about when they say that they cleared out some of the less family-friendly elements. There's also one that says night brings out the dark side of Archer Park's split personality. And so you get these like early documentations of the police pushing back against this visible community that's forming. But by the early 1990s, Archer Park was less prominent as a visible hangout spot where people would go to just hang out, but it still continued to have a reputation where people would go at the end of the night or people would go to meet other people. And even into the 2000s, it was known as a spot where people who were still closeted and maybe wouldn't go to a gay bar as a result would go to meet other people. The first gay bar, in terms of what we would call a gay bar today in the Valley, was Duffy's Tavern. And Duffy's Tavern had been open since the 1940s. It had had several different owners, but in the early 1970s, it's purchased by a couple, George and Helen. And Helen had a lot of gay friends, and she had previously worked at the bar before purchasing it. And I don't know if she ever had the intention of making it a gay bar originally, but she started telling a lot of her queer and trans friends that they could come hang out at the bar, that they could be themselves and that they could be accepted there. So it starts getting a large gay crowd going there on certain nights. And at some point, they realize that they're getting a lot of money from this gay clientele, so they open the bar as a specifically gay bar. And in 1975, by 1975, they're already advertising it as a gay bar in several national publications. So in several statewide publications, So this is an ad from a statewide publication called This Week in Texas, which was an LGBTQ publication that started in the 1970s and came out every week and would have a list of all the different bars in the area, by area, so like Dallas, Houston, the Valley. And this is an ad from there. So by this point, they're advertising themselves as a specifically gay bar. It was really important because there weren't a lot of places where queer people could gather or congregate at the time. And this was really the first, besides like parks or nature centers. And it was really small. There was almost no room to dance. There were no windows because you didn't want to see people seeing you in there. There was just a little crack in the door where you would look outside. And the music all came from a jukebox. And at first, if you look at this ad, it says now with dancing. That was because when it first became a gay bar, they didn't allow same-sex couples to dance because they were worried that the police would use that as an excuse to come in and raid the place. So they were very strict about PDA, kissing and dancing and things like that. But you could still go in, have a drink, and meet other people like yourselves. As it evolved, they became a little more relaxed about that. And they even had a drag show on July 4th of 1976. And this is the first big drag show that we know of taking place in the Valley itself. There were most likely drag shows that took place in some of the smaller cantinas in downtown Mcallen and Brownsville. But this was the first drag show that started to pave the way for the later drag scene that came. There were 5 queens that performed. They performed, all the music came out of a jukebox. They had a makeshift stage in the corner of the bar. And one of the people who performed was Shady Lady, who later became a famous drag queen. She passed away in 2016, but she was known across the state. And she would roll around on the floor. She would do a lot of comedy bits, but she would also do like glamour shows with like more, glamour and pageantry. And she became a really important part of the Texas drag community. Other queens who performed that night were Vera Cruz, Tito, Rolando, and then Isaac Sanchez, who became known as Sashay Sanchez. And Isaac, or Sashay, was an important early figure in the drag community. He later became an MC who would MC at a lot of the shows in the Rio Grande Valley. And this is a picture of Isaac when he was a teenager. Isaac has a really important early role in the history in that he was the first queer person to be out about being queer on local television. And so he's a gay man. He identifies as gay. And he actually does not like the term queer like a lot of older LGBTQ plus people because that term was such a slur for a lot of people at the time. But the local news center was looking for somebody to do a story on being gay in the Valley. And it was in response to a visit by a national figure named Anita Bryant. She was a singer who decided to start this like one-woman crusade when a lot of cities started having local ordinances protecting LGBTQ plus rights. Anita Bryant made it her mission to speak out against them and to try to limit gay rights in the late 1970s. And she even did a tour of the South where she spoke at different cities about why she believed that there shouldn't be any non-discrimination ordinances and that gay people were a sin and didn't deserve rights. And when she came to Mcallen, they were looking for somebody to speak about her visit and to talk about being an out gay person in the Valley. And they couldn't find anyone, not surprisingly, who was willing to talk on camera about being gay. But they found, a lot of people told them that if they looked for Isaac, that he'd be willing to do it. He was known at this time, he was already doing drag, he had this like big booming voice and this loud personality. And so he was working at the time at a hotel across the street from Archer Park, and the news camera just came in while he was there working and asked if he'd be willing to do this story, and he did it. He talked about the need for tolerance and acceptance But this was a really historic event because it was the first time somebody came out on a local media station and talked about their experiences of being a gay person. This is my uncle. His name was Leonardo Mena. He was a really important figure in the community because he opened one of the first gay bars to be owned by a gay person. He was originally from Reynosa, Mexico, and in the 1970s, like a lot of people from Reynosa moved to the valley to start to, a lot of people in Reynosa moved to the valley to start living authentically and live as themselves. So there were a lot of trans and gay people who moved from Reynosa to Mcallen around this time, and he was one of them. And he was really into drag, and he wanted to grow the local drag scene. And these are some pictures of him that I got through doing this work. I had actually never seen a picture of him as an adult when I first started, when I was growing up. I knew he was gay and I knew he had been murdered, but I knew very little about him. So when I started doing this work, I found out that he, had owned this really important early club, that he was really involved in growing the local drag scene, that he had been involved in planning the first Pride Month celebration in the Valley in 1992, and all these things about how important he was in the history that I never would have known because my family didn't really talk about it. And they really didn't know. But he opened the Evolution in Mcallen, and it was a lot bigger than Duffy's. It had room for dancing. It had room for drag. Again, he loved drag, so he started giving opportunities to a lot of local performers to really flourish and bloom at the Evolution. The Evolution was open for about 6 months, and then he bought the Etc., which was located on 11th and a half Street in Pecan. It became known by several different names during the time it was open, but the name that everybody remembers it by the most is Bumpers, which is the name it had in the early 80s until it closed. And this is a picture of someone dancing and performing at the Etc. And the Etc. was located down an alley. You kind of had to go through a dark alley to get to it because at the time 11th and a half Street was kind of like this narrow little street. And this also happened at Duffy's, and I forgot to mention it when I was talking at Duffy's. But as soon as people knew that there was a gay bar there, they started to congregate there to try to harass, and they would sometimes beat up people who were leaving the bar. They would throw bottles, they would throw rocks, they would drive by and scream obscenities at people, but people kept showing up. And I think that's really important to remember that going to a gay bar at the time wasn't the way going to a gay bar is now. It wasn't just a matter of oh, I'm gonna go out and have fun and be with my friends. You were facing the very real risk that you might be attacked, that you might be harassed, that you might be beaten up or even killed, and yet people kept coming. And the community would often support each other. So if they knew that someone had gotten beat up, they would go out and try to protect them. But a trans woman I interviewed named Misty Duvall, who's a really important part of this history, she talked to me about how that sort of taught her that she had to stand her ground and she had to be independent and be strong because otherwise she wasn't going to be able to make it as who she was. These are some pictures of people dancing at Bumpers. These are all from the late 70s, early 80s. And one person that came out of Bumpers was Sweet Savage, who was from Edinburgh. She grew up in what people describe as the barrio of Edinburgh at the time. And she eventually became nationally famous. And she won Miss Gay US of A in 1993. And in a time before social media or RuPaul's Drag Race, to become nationally known as a drag queen took a lot of work. She was on a lot of national talk shows, including The Donahue Show. And Bumpers had a Star Search where they would allow different local queens to compete for a chance to be in the show at the bar, and they would compete and get a spot to perform. And a lot of local drag queens, some of whom are still performing to this day, like Lady Laura, who's in these pictures, got their start at Bumpers during those nights. This is a picture of Joshua St. Michael, who was an important early drag king in the Valley. There were actually a lot of drag kings in the 70s and 80s in the Rio Grande Valley. There was a big booming scene of them, and that's not something we see as much today. And these are two other drag queens who performed at Bumpers at the time, Takisha Murray and Monique Duvall. And this is a pageant taking place at Bumpers. And Takisha Murray was a trans woman who we interviewed, and she said that drag at the time was kind of an escape for the community. If you were going through all these horrible things, rejection by your family, the risk of violence, later the HIV/AIDS epidemic, it was nice to be able to go to a bar and just watch a show and escape. And if you look at these pictures and you see the fantasy involved in these glamorous, extravagant outfits, you can kind of see what it must have been like to come from a place like the Valley and go into a bar and see a world like this. And there were also friendships that formed at Bumpers, people who met at Bumpers for the first time, and there were pageants at Bumpers, which was an important part of the community growing. So pageants were opportunities for drag queens to compete against each other. These are some flyers featuring Misty Duvall and Takisha Murray winning some of these pageants. PBD's opened in the early 1980s, and it remains open to this day. It's one of the oldest gay bars in South Texas. And PBD's is really important in the history because it's still open to this day and because of that longevity and the role it's played in the community. But it's also important because there's a lot of urban legends around it. Even the name, right? There's a lot of people who say it stands for this, and there's a lot of different competing theories about what the acronym stands for and where it came from. There's also kind of an urban legend in the community that sprung up around the opening of PBDs. Some people say that it was originally a biker bar, and when the owners purchased it, a gay man purchased it and made it into a gay bar, that the bikers were upset and they came back to the bar trying to reclaim the space, and that the gay men fought against them and literally pushed them out of the bar. And so that the bar was born out of as an early site of resistance, and that because of that, it's gonna, always remain open. Someone we interviewed told us that, and I thought that was a really cool story. These are some early pictures of PBDs. PBDs was originally known as mostly a men's bar and mostly for older people. Some people describe it as like a leather bar, but it probably never really was that active in that way, but it was like more of a neighborhood bar versus like Bumpers or later 10th Avenue where you would see a more extravagant show. There weren't any drag performances at PBDs until later in the mid to late 1990s when you started to see that, but it definitely has a lot of drag shows now. Here's some other early important pictures from PBDs. The upper deck in South Padre Island was an important early queer space in the valley. It was opened in the 1980s and it was the first gay bar on the island, but it was also a hotel and a resort. And someone we interviewed said it kind of answered that question, which is like, where do gay people go on vacation when they can't just go anywhere and be themselves? And so it attracted a lot of people from the valley who would drive out there, but it also attracted a lot of people from all around the United States. It started appearing in national LGBTQ plus travel magazines and publications, and so it was kind of a popular spring break destination for gay people from all around the United States who would travel there to enjoy it. And someone also mentioned that it was the first place you could really be gay and be outside, beyond a park. So these are some pictures of Lyle's deck. On the island also in the early 1980s, you had a drag performance troupe called Nightlife and Company that would perform, and it was led by Joshua St. Michael, who was the drag king you saw performing at Bumpers earlier. And a lot of the people who performed were women, which was a little different from what you usually saw at typical drag shows. And they did these really elaborate staged group numbers. So they had like a Pac-Man number. They had a number where Laurie lit something on fire and threw it out into the audience. And they had all these kind of like over-the-top numbers that you didn't really see done at like typical drag shows at the time. 10th Avenue opens in 1987. 10th Avenue is one of the most important gay bars in Valley history. It was open until 2002 when it was forced closed by the city, which is a story we tell in the documentary. But 10th Avenue had 2 floors. It had a bigger dance floor. It had really elaborate drag shows, and it kind of became the dominant space in the Valley for most of the time that it was open. It saw several generations of queer people find community and find themselves there. A lot of people remember 10th Avenue fondly because it was the first time they met anybody like themselves. One young person that we interviewed who identified as non-binary talked about how they were treated like miserably at school. They didn't really have anybody who accepted them, but they could go to 10th Avenue and find this giant community of people who embraced them. And so these are some pictures of 10th Avenue that show you kind of the grandeur of the structure and how big it is. Just Terry's was the first lesbian bar in the Valley, and it was open in the early 1990s. And somebody that we interviewed talked about how at the time that most of the bars catered to men because men had more money than women. Women didn't earn as much money. And so this space was really important because it allowed women to congregate in a space geared towards them, like lesbian and bisexual women. And I love that a lot of the pictures we have are of drag shows because that was what was being documented at the time. But if you look in the corners, you can kind of see some pictures of the patrons, and you can imagine what their lives must have been like, and what their lives must have looked like, and what their lives were like. And it's really cool to see just these like early documentations of like lesbian and bisexual women just being themselves. And gender presentation in the lesbian community was really interesting because in the Valley you saw a lot of times like a strict adherence to that butch-femme dichotomy where one partner was very, very feminine and one person was very, very masculine, and those were kind of the only 2 options. There were always people that existed outside of that, but it is something you tend to see in a lot of early lesbian spaces in the Valley. Another bar that opened and was possibly the first bar in Harlingen to open that stayed open for very long. There was a bar called Nuts and Cherries in the early 80s that was only open for a few months. Was Zippers, and Zippers was open in Harlingen and was kind of like a rough part of town. The police cracked down on Zippers a lot, and they would go in and kind of scare people off, or they would wait outside and harass people as they were leaving the bar. And in Harlingen also, I just wanted to point out really quickly that there were young people who would hang out in local parks, and you would have these queer kids from all of the local schools in Cameron County who would find each other and then go out and on weekends congregate at Dixieland Park in Harlingen. And they would have like dance-off competitions in the parking lot. And if somebody was missing, for example, they would go and check up on them and be like, is that person okay? And so even as the bars were kind of flourishing, there were people finding and creating community in other ways. HIV/AIDS hits the valley in the mid-'80s, and by the late 1980s starts to claim a lot of people's lives within the community. It was definitely viewed initially as a gay disease or a disease that only affected the gay population. And so you see a lot of rejection and stigma in the valley by the larger community once AIDS starts to become more visible and starts to be associated with this community. Some of the people we've interviewed have talked about how they lost all of their friends, how they lost hundreds of friends during this time, how they attended, it felt like they were attending a funeral every day, that their friends were dropping like flies around them. So it's impossible to underestimate the human toll of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the valley. One of the first organized responses you see to the AIDS crisis in the valley is Comfort House, or Casa Merced. And Casa Merced was started by a nun named Sister Marian Strohmeyer, and she opened this place called Casa Merced initially on Ware Road in Mcallen to house undocumented people who were coming from Central America fleeing war at the time in the 1980s. And as they started to come in smaller numbers, she decided to use the space to house people who were dying of AIDS or who were living with HIV who had been kicked out or rejected by their families. She eventually opens a spot in downtown Mcallen on Dallas Street, and she calls it the Comfort House. And that opens in 1988. And the majority of the people who were there were volunteers, and the majority of them came from the local LGBTQ plus community. And all they could really do was provide palliative care to people who were dying from HIV and AIDS. At the time, or from AIDS-related complications. At the time, local hospitals tended to treat those patients terribly if they even accepted them. Sometimes they wouldn't feed them, they wouldn't go in to change their bedding. Nurses were too scared to touch them, sometimes doctors were too scared to touch them. And so there wasn't really a lot of support for people living with HIV or who were dying from AIDS-related complications. And Comfort House gave people a space to be where they could get care in a non-rejecting place. And they did a lot of work with raising awareness about HIV/AIDS in the community, and they also had an activities center for people living with HIV. The Valley AIDS Council forms in 1988, and it was formed by several nurses from local hospitals, as well as people from Planned Parenthood, and it becomes the first attempt to start educating and providing prevention services to the community in response to the AIDS crisis. And at the time, there wasn't a lot known about the virus. New stuff was being found out all the time. And so all they could really do was provide education and condoms and encourage people to get tested once tests became available. Valley Voice was born out of a meeting at the Valley AIDS Council. Oscar Raul Lopez, who at the time worked at the Valley AIDS Council, wanted to have a meeting with members of the local community in order to see what needs they had that weren't being addressed. And a lot of people who were in that room at the time, something like 60 or 70 people showed up, talked about wanting a space to socialize outside of the bar scene. And so there was this need for people to get together and to be able to learn and to be able to find community in more than just going to a bar. And so what was formed was a group called Valley Voice. And two of the most active members of Voice for a lot of the time that was in existence were Alicia Lugo and Laurie Coffey, who are pictured here. And Valley Voice initially started as a support group, and then it expanded once more and more people started coming into a meetup group. And so they would have meeting, they would rent a room from a hotel in Harlingen, and they would have these meetings where people could just come and experience community, but then they would also have social events where they would go bowling or do volleyball or go to San Antonio, go to the island. And then they would also have educational workshops where they would have people come and speak, for example, about how to protect your rights if your partner was dying of AIDS and you weren't legally married because there was no marriage equality, or how to come out to your parents, or about the importance of mental health in the LGBTQ plus community. So these are some pictures of Valley Voice meetings. And again, Valley Voice started in the late 1980s and it went until around 1996. And a lot of young people started coming to Valley Voice meetings as soon as they found out about it. And so this was also a really important resource because it was open to minors. They were really protective about the minors. Minors weren't allowed to date, older people, and they wanted to make sure it was a safe and inclusive space because a lot of these kids were coming from school systems and families that did not accept or support them. And so you started to see this youth contingent of Valley Voice form, and they were affectionately called the Little Darlings. And a lot of those kids were bi or questioning or non-binary or trans, and it was a really important space for them to be able to just exist and find other people like themselves. These are some pictures of the little darlings, who again were youth from all around the valley who would sometimes hitchhike to be able to go to Valley Voice meetings. Some more pictures of some of those, the little darlings. And Valley Voice would have fundraisers to support people in the community who were affected by HIV and AIDS. At the time, there wasn't a lot of places for these people to turn, and so they would have chicken plate sales and drag shows to support these people. Some of these people were actually children who came from straight or heterosexual families and were diagnosed with the virus at a young age. And so Valley Voice would have drag shows to support these children because they were often rejected by the local community, and their families would have nowhere else to turn to but the LGBTQ plus community. 5 minutes? Okay. Valley Voice also had a publication called In Touch magazine, which they would publish throughout the early 1990s, and it included contributions from members of the local community, and it included contributions from members of the local community, and it was distributed for free at all of the different local gay bars. It would have news about LGBTQ plus representation, politics, HIV and AIDS, and this is a really cool window into what the community was like at the time. They had a column from one of the little darlings called From the Teen Side, where they would talk about issues related to teens. And Valley Voice was also involved in organizing the first Pride in the Rio Grande Valley. And the first Pride, as we know it, took place in 1992 at 5 different gay bars, 1 in Reynosa, 4 here in the Valley, and they were raising money for some of the different organizations like Comfort House and the Valley AIDS Council. And the culminating event was at Zippers in Harlingen, and it was called the Pansy Pachanga, and that's where we got the inspiration for our documentary. And these are some pictures of the Pansy Pachanga. They had like a rally, and they also reenacted the Stonewall Riots. And the Stonewall Riots were what gave birth to Pride in 1969. So some of the little darlings wrote and acted in a play about the Stonewall Riots. And in later years, they had Pride celebrations in 93, 94, 95, and 1996. There were pageants involved, fundraisers for local gay bars. Valley Voice was also instrumental in creating panels for the National AIDS Quilt, commemorating people from the Rio Grande Valley who had died of HIV and AIDS. You could make a 3x6 foot panel honoring your loved one that was supposed to be a creative representation of their life. And so this was a way for the community to collectively mourn when stigma prevented people from even acknowledging that their loved one had died of AIDS. You started to see the growth of a visible trans community at 10th Avenue in Mcallen in the early 1990s. Again, there had always been trans people, but you saw more and more coming out around this time. And even in 1993, there was an article done in the Monitor interviewing Takisha Murray, Valerie Perez, and Misty Duvall, all of whom either were out as trans by that point or eventually came out as trans. And Takisha Murray became the first trans person in a local media source to talk about her transition. 10th Avenue also has the Hana Knights in the early 1990s, which gave people an opportunity to dance Tejano when they might not have been able to do so anywhere else. And a lot of people we interviewed talked about the impact of being able to do that when you've been rejected by everyone around you, to be able to do something you saw people doing around you all your life in an accepting and affirming space. Betty Crocker is an important drag queen who comes out of 10th Avenue, who became really well known and continues to perform to this day for her body positivity and her unique performance style. There was a series of murders, unfortunately, that took place in the community in the early 1990s. A lot of members of the trans community and other members of the LGBTQ plus community were killed in a series of probably connected hate crimes. There's no official estimate, but all of these cases remain open to this day. And some of the most important, most visible people in the trans community were killed at the time. Candy Red, a trans woman who performed at 10th Avenue, was killed. My uncle was killed during this time. And again, these remain unsolved. And it's a story we tell in the documentary. You start to see the rise of a lot of queer families around this time. In the late 80s, early 1990s, a lot of people who make the decision to start having family and raising children, and people would have commitment ceremonies at 10th Avenue because, again, there was nowhere else to do that before marriage equality. And you would see people getting together. Maybe somebody came out after being married and having kids, and they would get together with their queer partner and raise those children together. And there's a church that forms in 1992 called the Metropolitan Community Church of Christ. And it was constructed in Alamo. Members literally built it from the ground up. And there had been a church in Brownsville in the early 1980s that was also an MCCC that didn't last for too long, but people had this desire to be able to worship in an affirming space because, again, spirituality and faith are really important in the Valley, but not a lot of spiritual places are accepting of this community. And so they formed this church in rural Alamo in the early 1990s, and it eventually grew into New Hope. and that started meeting in Harlingen, and then it became the Mount Calvary Christian Church, which remains open to this day. The Glsa at UTPA forms in 1992, and this is the first known student group in the Rio Grande Valley to form, and it starts at UTPA in Edinburgh, and it's a group that's made up of just LGBTQ plus students who find each other at the university and decide that they need to have a space to be able to gather as students. A lot of these kids met at 10th Avenue, and they would also hang out, at one of the quads at UTPA. And they formed this group, and initially their main goal is to just raise awareness in the university community about their existence and about the club, and about queer and trans students at the club. But in 1994, they're featured on the cover of Rio magazine. And at the time, only one of them was really out to their families, the president, Daniel Hernandez, who also took these pictures. So the rest came out in shadow and from the back. And interestingly, the family members of one of these people knew, just from looking at him, who was who he was. And so this was really important because it was a university publication featuring and highlighting this community. And it talks about, coming out of the shadows, and it talks about the experiences and struggles that these kids faced being out LGBTQ plus people in the Valley in the early 1990s. And the group eventually evolves into Global, the Gay and Lesbian and Bisexual Alliance, and these are some pictures of Global. And Global had an event called Getting to Know You, where they would have they had people dressed in as the village people, who were trying to recruit new members on the first day of school. And Global was really visible at the school, and that was really important for a lot of early LGBTQ plus students at the school, even if they didn't necessarily participate in it. There was Miss Harlingen, was a pageant that took place, and one of the reasons I think it's important and that I bring it up is because Frank Mendez, who competed in the pageant, was a drag queen who was out about his status. He made the decision to be out about his status as having HIV as soon as he was diagnosed in 1992. And in his drag alter ego of Jackie Fabiani, he would use his performances to raise awareness about AIDS and HIV and about the need to get tested and the need to fight against HIV/AIDS stigma. And he was determined to win a title because he realized if he won a title, he would have an even bigger audience. So he won Miss Harlingen in 1996 and went on to compete in Miss Texas. And as far as we know, he was really the only out person competing in the pageant system at the time, talking about his HIV/AIDS diagnosis. He also used drag as a way to raise awareness and raise money for HIV/AIDS related causes. This is him and 4 other drag queens performing as the Spice Girls at a community center in Mercedes in the mid-1990s. You start to see some straight bars in the late 1990s embrace drag and have gay nights. So Club X, which always had a large queer community, even though it wasn't specifically a gay bar, starts to have these nights called the Birdcage Review in the mid-1990s, where they invite some of the local drag queens to perform. They performed on a stage that was a recreation of a Keith Haring mural. B104 in 1998 celebrates its 25th year anniversary. And if you grew up in the Valley, you probably remember B104. And they had gone to 10th Avenue, someone from the radio station had gone to 10th Avenue and seen this elaborate drag show done by a drag queen named Taylor Monroe from Weslaco. That was inspired by the movie Studio 54, and they just asked her to recreate it for their B104 anniversary show, and so the drag queens got to perform along with pop singer Taylor Dayne. 10th Avenue closes in the early 2000s, and it's forced closed by the city. The city really takes, people have different memories and different stories about this, but it seems that the city and residents around the gay bar were just really upset that this place was so big and so visible and so just visibly queer. And so eventually there's several legal battles, but eventually the city wins and the club is forced to close. There were a lot of complaints about noise. There were a lot of trans and queer youth who would gather outside of 10th Avenue. Some of them were runaways. Some of them were people who had been pushed out by their family, and they would gather in the streets around 10th Avenue. Some of them did survival sex work because they had no other economic options. And so there were a lot of complaints about that as well from some of the local residents. And this is a picture of Carlos Villarreal, who is an artist, and he was the first known person to take a same-sex date to prom in the Rio Grande Valley. And that's really notable because he kind of, as he says, opened the floodgates for a lot of different people to start doing the same. And I'm sure it happened before, but this is the first time that it was documented and that we know of. And he officially took another boy to prom at Mission High School in 1997, and he's the one on the left. And he hadn't told his parents. He'd forged a permission slip for him to be able to do so, and he didn't know that it was going to be such a big deal until he got there and there were news cameras taking pictures because they'd heard of this first same-sex prom date. But he said that in the following years, people would tell him that because of him, they were able to do the same. And so it's an example of the power of individual impact and the power that we can have when we decide to be visible and out, and even if there's risks involved. And I love this picture. And this is a story we tell in more depth in the documentary. Then the last thing I'll share is about Hugs. Hugs was the first GSA in the Valley. A GSA is a gay-straight alliance, and it formed in Nicky Rowe High School in the early 2000s. In the 2000 school year, a student had taken his own life. He had identified as bisexual, and he was having a lot of issues with his family accepting him. And so some of his friends and fellow students and some teachers decided that they wanted to form a club to provide support to other students going through similar issues and to prevent someone from doing the same thing. So they formed a group called Hugs, which was helping unite gays and straights. Some of the people who formed it were Crystal Mendoza, Orlando Campa, and Mary Pat Strong was the faculty sponsor. We interview all three of them for the documentary. And Mary Pat Strong was a teacher who had been, part of the LGBT community in the Valley for several decades, but when she went into teaching, she knew that she had to kind of keep her sexuality hidden, because if not, she risked losing her job and her career. But she took a risk by helping start Hugs, and Hugs was cracked down on by the school administration, but they continued to fight and continued to resist. The school administration told them they couldn't mention sexuality, that they couldn't have certain events. They forced them to change the name at one point to Teens Against Prejudice, and eventually they got the ACLU involved, and that's a story we tell in our documentary about that fight and about how they eventually won that fight and were able to form as a club. And in 2002, Crystal Mendoza, one of the co-founders of Hugs and its first vice president, gets featured in The Advocate, which is a national LGBTQ plus publication. She gets featured as one of the coolest straight people of the year for 2002 for her role in helping start the club. And they come down at Bishop Park and they do an interview with her. They take a picture of her at Bishop Park, and they, when we interviewed her for the documentary, we went back and we did it at the same park. And so I'm really excited for people to know that story, because it's really inspiring to know that a bunch of kids, doing what they felt was right, stood up to all of these systems that were trying to stop them from existing, and were able to have a positive change as a result. And I think it's really important to remember in our history that we're often the ones who do so, even if we have limited resources, even if there's a lot of risks involved, that history is made by people who stand up for themselves and who have the courage to fight against these systems that are telling us we shouldn't exist. And I think that's a really important part of our history. So I'm going to end by talking, there's been a lot more. I usually end with Hugs, but our community has continued to grow and to evolve, and there's so many more resources and so much more visibility here in the Valley than there was, even when I was growing up. And I think our history is still being written, our future is still being made, and we can be a part of making that history. So Pansy Pachanga is a documentary that's coming up that I'm working on, again, with Ronnie Garza and Charlie Vela, and it's about the history of the Valley's LGBTQ plus community. And Pansy Pachanga is been featured in The Monitor, and we've interviewed about 75 people, a few more, and we're really excited to show this history and to let people tell this history in their own words as well. So I hope this was just a brief introduction. Again, there's so much more history to document, and history is still being made to this day. And if you want to learn more, you can follow Pansy Pachanga on Instagram at Pansy Pachanga, Facebook at Pansy Pachanga, and we have a YouTube channel where we've shared a few videos, but the Instagram is where we're the most active. And on the Instagram, a few times a week, I'll share a picture from Valley LGBTQ plus history along with a story about that picture. So if you want to learn more, there's obviously so much history. I always really struggle to keep it under an hour, but you can learn more by going to the Instagram. And thank you so much.